This is Euroscopic, a podcast that happens when a journalist from America's North and one from America's South see the world from the place they met, the center of Europe. I'm William Glucroft.
And this is Martin Gack.
And today is Friday, September 15th, 2023. In this week's episode, we're looking at catastrophes from Greece to North Africa, the race to lead the European Investment Bank, Ursula von der Leyen's State of the Union address, plus a story or two that will take us into next week. Now, let's get into the week that was and why. I guess my first question for you, Martin, is: are you feeling safe?
Yeah, I mean, I think I generally feel very safe, although I must say that we're sitting down, just shooting the breeze here, my wife, my kids, and then my phone, my computer, her phone, her computer, and the iPhone of the next door neighbor that was for a few minutes bringing in some plates that we have left. They all went off together, and they started kind of beeping and singing and shouting, screaming, and we couldn't quite figure out for like 2 minutes. We thought, or for 30 seconds maybe, we thought that maybe the Russians were actually marching over the border, and we had to go to the basement. It was just actually a test of the German safety and alarm system.
I was in a similar situation. I actually knew it was going to happen because I had listened to the news in the morning, but then I quickly forgot because I was having breakfast with my parents, who were still in Berlin at the time. We were having breakfast on the balcony. Yes, all of a sudden, all of our phones went off, including their phones, although they're American, but they were connected to the local network. So their phones also got the "this is just a test" warning from the German catastrophe agency, basically, or population protection authorities. And the Germans are very proud of, because they haven't been so good with their technology in terms of being able to reach essentially everyone with a phone or everyone with some kind of device. This was a big problem after the 2021 floods, and they really had to rework their system. And of course, Germany has data protection issues and privacy issues in terms of what the government can access. So it's been quite both a technological and bureaucratic hurdle for them to put this system in place.
So do you feel safer?
I guess it's better than in 2021, but I'm thinking about what happens if the cell phone networks go down. I think I also read a headline that in Berlin, there's actually no physical sirens. So if the cell phone networks go down, if technology is the issue, then are there enough physical sirens to actually alert people of something going on? But I certainly feel safer. I certainly feel safer and more protected, fortunately, than the absolutely tragic events happening in both Morocco and Libya this week, which, of course, has massive human implications. Cost of human life in those areas, and is really just a stone throws away across the Mediterranean. Martin, how are you looking at the earthquake in Morocco and the massive floods in Libya?
Obviously, this was at the very top of the headlines for pretty much the entire week. And what was quite brutal to see is that obviously, the Morocco story being tragic is compounded by the fact that probably the inaction or the incapacity of the state has costed a lot of lives. The story in Libya is absolutely egregious because, as a matter of fact, I mean, the flood was produced by a breach of a dam, and there was no warning to the inhabitants down water. And this is just something that, should constitute sort of an administrative crime. I mean, the question I think that these two stories bring very close to each other, the same week and in the same region, is, how prepared are these states that have been actually the recipients of development funds and that have been the recipients of European aid? What has happened with that? Which in the end, they're still sort of in a situation in which 20,000 people are actually killed because the most basic, mechanisms or things are not in place.
At the same time, we're seeing thousands of migrants landing on Lampedusa, the Italian island that's quite close to the North African coast, in a place that in best of circumstances, can only really safely house a few hundred people. We know already that Italy, I mean, the European Union, of course, more broadly, but Italy in a really acute sense is not such a big fan of migrants, and has their resources stretched thin when it comes to thousands of people showing up on their shore. Martin, what are the potential political implications here?
This is bound to also produce sort of migration movements, which will probably last for a while, because we're talking, I mean, in the case of Morocco, we're talking about a vast piece of territory. The case of Italy is actually quite particular because they are actually sitting with in very, very, very much in the far right corner, and they have an executive that has come to power on the promises of curbing migration. Meloni has actually been forced to hear from the opposition the fact that, even campaigning on solving the migration problem, reality has imposed itself, and she has not been able to do it. So she has failed at her most basic sort of promise.
Yeah, I mean, Matteo Salvini is basically calling this arrival of thousands of migrants all at once an act of war, essentially, and that Italy will use all means at its disposal to defend itself from what he and I guess his government, or at least his allies in government, see as an act of war. I mean, that's strong language.
Well, he's not known for refinement, elegance, or finesse. By exaggeration, he has built his political persona and his political project. Keep in mind that it's actually their government that has been one of the main proposers of putting inordinate amount of money. 1 billion euros is what has been promised to Tunisia in Northern Africa for the state to sort out migration, when the state cannot even sort out alarms for floods and natural catastrophes.
What's so stunning here is, when we were putting this episode together, the story was the storms in Greece that have wreaked havoc on Greece's food production and agricultural sector. And now that seems like small change in comparison to what's happened in Libya, because it was the same weather system. It was this, what they're calling a metacane, basically a hurricane that develops in the Mediterranean. It hit Greece, and then it strengthened over the Mediterranean, and then slammed into Libya. And then, as you said, the lack of infrastructure, the lack of political institutions, et cetera. As always, we call these natural disasters, but I'm always skeptical. And I'm a bit hesitant to call them natural disasters, because it seems to let the human side and the human responsibility to these catastrophes kind of get away without taking responsibility, as you've laid out. And now Greece, which itself is a major story, and the hit that it's taken is almost not even talked about, just because of how much worse things look in Libya. I'm wondering, Martin, you talked about the European political responsibility, given all the aid that's gone to a lot of these countries and what's happened with this aid. But a lot of European power has also been meted out. I'm thinking specifically of Libya, with French and British military intervention in the lead up to getting rid of Muammar Gaddafi about a decade ago, more than a decade ago by this point. From that vantage point, Martin, what do you see is Europe's political responsibility?
This is something that we see every time that a Western force sort of lands to sort out the dirty laundry of a regime that they sort of happen not to like, and in many of these cases they used to like. There is no capacity building, there is no sort of familiarization of a state. I mean, my particular position is that if you're actually going to be doing intervention, then you might as well just get into the business of colonization and stop pretending that, as a matter of fact, I mean, this is really just for hearts and minds. So I think that, to answer your question sort of very succinctly, I mean, a lot, not because it is just Europe's responsibility to sort out Libya's problem, but it is a chance that, Europe had to help sort out Libya's problems, Tunisia's problems, I mean, Algeria's problems, Morocco's problems, and they did not. The fact is that we are exactly where we started, perhaps much worse.
The interconnectedness between climate change and lack of action on climate change, and how that weaponizes essentially natural disasters, weather, climate events, which then pushes on the infrastructure and political limits of these developing countries that themselves have been under colonial or post-colonial or neo-colonial pressures of European powers and the Americans through military force and through the financial system, which then drives the migrants into Europe, which then weaponizes politics in Europe. This circular, interconnectedness of just a political shit show really is almost, you can understand why people just don't want to, even at political levels, let alone, average voters, don't want to really look at the big picture, because it's just the circular nature of it is really crazy.
And with this story, we will inaugurate what I hope will be the economic section of our podcast, which hopefully will not put people to sleep.
Well, this is the problem with the EU in general, right? Talking about EU issues. I mean, the European Union is foremost an economic block, right? It's about money and trade and markets. So it's always a challenge to figure out how to keep people awake when talking about the EU, since so much of EU news goes through sort of economic channels. But we do have some movements going on with the EIB, the European Investment Bank, which is different than the European Central Bank, of course, the ECB, which, of course, raised interest rates to its highest ever in the history of the euro this week in an effort to continue combating inflation. So we're not going to talk too much about the ECB. We want to talk about the EIB. And first of all, Martin, what the hell is the EIB?
Well, I mean, if you actually do believe that Europe is first and foremost an economic arrangement of parts, actually, you would think that the EIB is kind of at its core, because it's the one institution that is, in charge of, in the banking sector of Europe, is one institution that is in charge essentially of just giving money away. It's actually an investment bank. They put money into development. They actually finance various initiatives since 1958, I believe, which is the year in which they sort of started operating. The bank has actually dispensed something like €1 trillion in money, in euro money, which of course in 58 there was none. The EIB is essentially an institution that is there to dispense money. A lot of the focus is actually in line very often with the European Commission. So the European Commission tends to set policy goals, and then the EIB goes out and sort of puts money on those things. So obviously climate change and climate, and environmental policy, that has been a very big issue for the von der Leyen Commission, is also kind of at the top of the list of the things that the EIB has been putting cash into over the von der Leyen tenure.
Which brings us to what's going on, in this time period right now in this week with the EIB's head or new head up for the picking. So Martin, walk us through, what does this mean? Who's up for the job, and what is that, and what its potential impact can be?
So it's quite clear that there is going to be sort of a pony race of political figures, and that's exactly what we have. So there is no technical discussion, right? It's not that we're looking at technicians that are completely unknown. A lot of the people that would actually be named for the position are people that those of us who are looking at politics in different European countries would probably recognize. First and foremost, of course, Margrethe Vestager, who is the Danish, until recently, commissioner of all sorts of things, including green issues at some point, then competition under the last part of Juncker, and so on and so forth. She just stepped down, and she's actually being considered for the position. So she's a thorough insider, and she's somebody that actually has become very well known for picking up fights with, as you might remember, with Google and Apple, where she actually slams many of these companies with major fines of the likes that they had not seen before. The second person is actually another Brussels insider, less known. Her name is Nadia Calviño. She is somebody that is sort of, a close and important part of the Spanish government. And as a matter of fact, she has been involved in investment issues around digitalization and things of the kind. It's somebody that was sort of a she actually would be sort of a well-known name for any Spaniard. And once again, we have somebody that, although like Vestager, they have some amount of sort of technical knowledge, obviously. They are also essentially political. They would be sort of political appointments. The one person I didn't mention that I think it's really worth mentioning is Daniele Franco, who is an Italian economist. And Daniele Franco was a minister. He was generally known as a technocrat who was not particularly political and managed to keep somehow out of the fray. Then he became minister for Mario Draghi. So the fact that he's being mentioned and the fact that, the Italian government is looking at figures around Draghi, because obviously he would have to have, the support of the Meloni government, the fact that somebody around Draghi is being pushed forth shows once again that, as many people are actually pointing out in relation to Meloni, that we have shifting tectonic plates politically, that what we have is actually a Meloni government that is supporting a Draghi person into a very high position of political financial decision making.
And that could have some big impact on, as you said, the kinds of digitalization and clean energy, climate-related policies that the European Commission, either this one or the next one, might want to enact, which I think is a great sort of segue into our main story of the week, which is, of course, the main story anyone who follows European politics is looking at, which was Ursula von der Leyen's State of the Union address, her annual address to the European Parliament that happened this week, potentially her last one, although maybe not. I mean, it's a very strange thing, the State of the Union address. It's such an American import of an idea. It's a bit stilted. It's a bit awkward. It's not like I don't get the sense that normal people in the European Union really watch it. It's really made for to take another American expression, inside the Beltway or inside Brussels kind of audience. What do you make of this State of the Union address?
This is not the U.S. So, the splintering of political interest and political concerns across all these countries means that, the person that von der Leyen or like a commission president addressing, does not really exist. So what did you think about it?
It was long, 63 minutes. I think I read it was her second longest address, State of the Union address. Which seems unnecessary, as we said, just given who its audience is, what the point of it is, who's listening. And to me, what was interesting is what did not get attention. Climate did not get a lot of mention. Migration did not get a huge mention. Energy did not get a huge mention. I mean, these are major issues that are on the forefront of challenges to the European Union and indeed the whole world. And von der Leyen didn't really talk about them. What did get the big mention, instead, was technology, AI, big tech in the U.S., and kind of making sure that the EU doesn't lose out on what is by most people being seen as the next big shock to the global economic system, the very way that we, to use a word that von der Leyen used a lot, the way we make money, the way we have our livelihoods.
One of the big problems that von der Leyen has is that a lot of conservatives, especially conservatives that are actually flirting with the idea of far-right operators like Meloni or Le Pen, should she come to power, are people that are pretty discontent with the type of Merkelian politics that they see von der Leyen's commission as having had. So I think that, leaving things like the European Climate Initiative out of the speech, it's just remarkable because it's been a centerpiece of her agenda, stated centerpiece and priority.
I think it's almost such an obvious question to even ask why that is, and the political backdrop here, seeing that we are going into European elections in the springtime. This is the end of her term as European Commission president. There's a lot of speculation about whether she'll run again, whether she'll have the support. And of course, she's throwing a bone to her conservative allies who she'll need the votes from if she wants to stay on as European Commission president. And of course, the EPP, the European People's Party, which is this collection of conservative parties in the European Parliament, they hate the Green Deal. They see it as basically anti-industrial or anti-industry. Bad for the economy, bad for big businesses, and of course they'll make the populist argument, bad for workers. And of course Ursula von der Leyen herself is a conservative. She's from the German Christian Democrats, which are part of the EPP alliance. She's from, you mentioned Merkelian politics, no surprise. She served in Merkel's various functions in Merkel's government. Most notably as one of the many kind of embarrassing defense ministers of Germany before she escaped to Brussels, as many European officials who are looking to get out of national embarrassments do. So it's a dumb question, or I should say it's an obvious question, Martin, but what role is the political landscape, the European elections that are coming up, what role is that playing in this speech and in von der Leyen's thinking?
It's almost impossible not to read every single one of these messages, particularly as we're seeing national elections shifting the political winds in different countries, as strong messages being sent to like allies and opponents in that context. As the EPP bloc sort of starts to face the music towards next year, but also sort of at a national level, conservatives are probably trying to pull the reins and see if they can actually redirect this kind of, soft conservative machine, sort of bring it back farther to the right. The far right will make absolutely sure to show the cost of the Green Deal sort of across the board.
So I think we've seen that the State of the Union address is foremost about interests and political jockeying, with very much an eye, if not both eyes, on European elections to come and the future of Ursula von der Leyen's personal political prospects. I think we saw one thing we didn't really touch on is this so-called or supposed anti-subsidy investigation against Chinese electric vehicles. That's kind of a favor, especially to the French. I think we're going to hold off on a future episode about that because we don't know what that's going to look like. But that's what was announced, this sort of anti-subsidy investigation. But it does speak to the regulatory power of the European Union, and the European Union as a global regulatory power. What it lacks in military might, it has in setting rules and regulations that the rest of the world has to follow. And I think that was so keenly distilled in the launch of the new iPhone this week, which will, of course, have the USB-C standard that the European Union has finally, after a lot of wrangling over years, has finally said this will be the standard for all devices. Martin, did you take note at that at all, that the most valuable company and an American company is bending to the will of European regulations?
It sends a very clear message that the European Union will actually beat even the most sort of powerful of financial muscles into line, and make what you want of it. It's still basically Apple taking design decisions and functionality decisions from the European Union. And I don't really foresee that in any way, shape, or form, regulators will become less popular by doing this. I mean, certainly with American legislators who will go out and try to bat for, the American company that is now in the crosshairs. But I think that this will be very, very good and will make a lot of consumers very, very happy. All of these companies, including things like, Twitter or whatever it's called now, Facebook, etc., into interoperability. And interoperability across the board would be a way actually to curb sort of the monopolic use of technology that many of these American companies have. So what other story are you looking at for this coming week?
Well, the other big story, of course, was the ARM IPO that happened this week, the much anticipated biggest IPO in years. There's been sort of an unofficial freeze on IPOs. There's been so much economic instability over the last couple of years, especially with the pandemic, that a lot of companies that have been wanting to go public on the stock exchange have been kept private. This was the big one. ARM is a British chips manufacturer that is hugely influential in chip designs that go into, speaking of phones, that go into all kinds of devices. And of course, advanced microchips are the basis of our world. And of course, with all this talk of AI, AI needs to run off of very powerful chips and ever more powerful chips. And ARM plays a huge role in that. That's at least the hope of those working at ARM, the executives at ARM, and of course its shareholders that would like to make a lot of money off of ARM finally going public. For me, we could talk, is not so much the financial question, but it's how interesting it is that this British company is not listing on the London Stock Exchange. It's listing on the NASDAQ in New York. And you see the same thing with Birkenstock coming up. The famous German sandal company is going to be going public, not in Germany, not in Frankfurt, but on the New York Stock Exchange. And of course, the reason for that is obvious, because you can make a lot more money in the United States than you can in certainly European markets, like the German one, and even the London Stock Exchange is nothing in comparison to what you can do in the US. And between this USB story and the ARM IPO, what I see here is the financial power of the United States and the regulatory power of the European Union that really has the opportunity to dominate the world. I mean, these two ends of this extreme, these two ends of policymaking and tools of policymaking in the West, of course, do dominate much of the world. But in all these questions about, the end of Western power, the end of American hegemony, the rise of China, all these fears that you hear from Western policymakers, this skittishness, a lot of that could be solved if American policymakers and European policymakers got together and joined forces and did what they do best, which is the U.S. Dominates the global financial system and the European Union dominates the regulatory system. And if you can put those two sources of power together, you're basically, China, Russia, India, rising powers in the global South do not stand a chance at breaking away from Western domination. I'm not making a moral judgment on that. I'm talking from a political and a policy perspective. Certainly the West and the United States wants to maintain its hegemony. I think the question or the challenge confronting U.S. and European policymakers is your enemy's enemy your friend? And as much as there's competition across the Atlantic, I believe they might be more worried about a rising China. But those are big picture developments that I think we'll be touching on forever, really, and in many more Euroscopic episodes to come, I hope.
That's it for this week's Euroscopic with William Glucroft and Martin Gack, written by us, produced by us, and edited by me. Euroscopic has no institutional backing or funding of any kind, so if you like what you hear, consider pledging your support. You can do that at euroscopic.substack.com. You can also like, subscribe, and share this and other episodes. We're available on Apple, Google, Spotify, and just about wherever your ears go for podcasts. Thanks again for listening, and we'll catch you again next week.